I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator, and it's my immense pleasure to introduce our speaker, the world's leading scholar on Spanish art and a great friend of the Frick Collection, Professor Jonathan Brown. Tonight, we celebrate his engaging new book, In the Shadow of Velázquez, A Life in Art History. Dr. Brown's far-ranging life in art history of scholarship, teaching, organizing international exhibitions, and engaging in often fraught debates about authentication of artworks has largely been launched from the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University, where he is Carol and Milton Petrie Professor. At the Institute, he has trained generations of Hispanists, some 30 of whom earned their doctorates with him, and have gone on to key positions in the field in North America, Spain, and Latin America. Countless non-specialists flock to his courses as well. As a scholar, he is rightly credited with establishing the field of Spanish art in the United States, with landmark exhibitions and publications on such artists as Zurbarán, Murillo, Ribera, Goya, and especially Velázquez, the artist who has never ceased to fascinate him. By the mid-1980s, he expanded his focus to include Spanish colonial art in Latin America, which is now, largely thanks to him, one of the fastest-growing areas in art history. In a marvelous bringing together of the two parts of his Hispanic world, he organized the first ever exhibition on Latin American art held at the Prado and at the Royal Palace of Madrid in 2010 and 11. At the Frick Collection and the Frick Art Reference Library, Professor Brown has been a primary mover in the museum's exhibitions and scholarly programs, offering a chance for many of us to experience up close his generosity of spirit and warmth as a mentor and colleague. Professor Brown first came on board at the library as a consultant to the publication of a 4-volume critical dictionary of Spanish artists, and then as a member of the museum's advisory council. The masterpieces of Spanish art in the collection soon captured his interest, resulting in a suite of exceptional exhibitions, publications, and symposia on works by Velázquez, El Greco, and Goya, as well as Spanish drawings. His infusion of life into this area of the collection has earned him an enduring place in the history of the museum and in the hearts of the many who have worked with him here. During these same years, Professor Brown also regularly urged the Frick to take advantage of the extraordinary resources of the Frick Art Reference Library for research on the history of collecting. As plans for the now well-established Center for the History of Collecting, headed up by Inga Reese, took shape, Professor Brown was an indispensable advisor to the process. The center's first major publication on the collecting of Spanish art in America is dedicated to him, another area in which he is a pioneer. Over the long decades of his career, Professor Brown has been awarded many honors. He delivered the Slade Lectures at Oxford and the Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery in Washington. He's been knighted by the King of Spain and given an award for his lifetime contributions to Spanish art from the University of Salamanca. More recently, he was the recipient of the Distinguished Scholar Award from the College Art Association. And last year, he was invited by the Prado to occupy the Cátedra del Prado, an honorary appointment made by the trustees to deliver 6 public lectures and to teach graduate seminars. In the lectures, entitled Autobiography as Historiography, the basis for his new book, he took a personal approach, looking back, often with humor, on the confluence of forces that shaped his path as a scholar, as we will hear this evening. Copies of the book will be available in the bookshop. Please join Jonathan and his family for a glass of wine in the garden court following his talk. And now please extend a warm welcome to our great good friend, Jonathan Brown.
Thank you very much. It's always a great pleasure to work with the Frick because, I'll raise this, I have many friends that I have formed over the years of my association with the Frick. Close colleagues, and in general, I think this is one of the kind of linchpins of my career as a historian of art. The lecture today is based, it's an abridged version of a chapter in my latest book, which is, as Susan Galassi has said, In the Shadow of Velázquez, A Career in Art History. And as the title perhaps suggests, I've tried to combine autobiographical data, not analysis, to my career, and also to try to understand how the historiography of Spanish art has progressed since the middle of the last century. To start, if I were asked to name the greatest painters of the 17th century, my immediate response would be Caravaggio, Rubens, Rembrandt, Poussin, and Velázquez. Admittedly, it is difficult to find the common thread that binds them. There's a certain logic that unites Caravaggio, Rembrandt, and Velázquez. All were painters who broke ranks with a classical tradition and to a greater or lesser extent used nature, that is to say, unmediated nature, as a source of inspiration. Poussin, of course, is a defining figure in the classical tradition, while Rubens dominated the mainstream of Western painting, infusing intellect and energy to almost every pictorial tradition then in existence. In most ways, however, these painters differ from one another. This is no surprise. The hallmarks of their genius are originality, individuality, and imagination. From the perspective of the art historian, there is an important difference that may not be perceptible to outsiders. This is the nature of the evidence for constructing their biographies, which includes such matters as how a person lives his life, the choices that he makes, the people he encounters, his thoughts about his engagement with the tradition of art. All of these considerations need to be taken into account as part of an artist's creative process. Although we are taught to acknowledge that even the primary sources are open to interpretation, there is still undeniable satisfaction in hearing from the artists themselves and from their contemporaries who observe their participation in the world of art and culture. It is worth a few minutes to review the sources upon which we base our understanding of these painters. Caravaggio, of course, did not write a word to explain the intention of his art. Nonetheless, the documentation of his life and the testimony of eyewitnesses are complete enough to allow us to analyze his artistic goals and reconstruct the course of his life in some detail. In our day, Caravaggio has achieved celebrity status. His life is melodramatic, marked by aggressive behavior to the point of murder, sexual license, daring pictorial innovation, and a grim, premature death. Hardly a year goes by without a book or exhibition dedicated to some part or aspect of his short career. From the standpoint of historiography, the life and art of Rembrandt are comparable to Caravaggio. Although the Dutch master left behind no written evidence on his artistic goals, his life is extensively documented and his basic premises are well understood. As a famous painter, his activities were observed and recorded by those among whom he lived. His final years, filled with loss and sadness, can be said to provide a prototype of the great artist rising above a sea of troubles to create great works, journeys into the soul which were revealed to those who saw his paintings. Rubens' life and art might be called super-documented. His network of friends, patrons, and admirers was spread throughout Europe, and he maintained contact by letter writing. His letters, which number around 250, permit us to enter both his private and public world and to understand some of the motives for creating art as he did. The sources for the reconstruction of the life art and artistic thought of Nicolas Poussin are abundant. The text of his letters, particularly with his French correspondent, Roland Freyard, Sieur de Chanteloup, his association with a circle of scholars of antiquity, notably Cassiano dal Pozzo, and from the early biography by Giovanni Bellori of 1672, there are many windows that open on Poussin's life and his views about the art of which he was a great master. Velázquez, in certain ways, is a case apart. Caravaggio, Rembrandt, Rubens, and Poussin were already famous in their day. Velázquez was little known outside the court in Madrid. Fortunately, substantial documentation exists concerning some of his mundane activities, particularly after his return from Italy in 1630. In an invaluable project, Angel Aterino and his associates published nearly 450 documents pertaining to the painter and his immediate family. While it's true that the majority of these documents were generated by his duties and responsibilities at the court of Philip IV, they can, like pieces of a mosaic, be fitted together with contemporary sources to compose an approximate portrait of the life and art of this tight-lipped subject. Furthermore, it is possible to tease a few hints from the sources about Velázquez as a person, which may help to enlarge our understanding of his art. The earliest full-scale biography of Velázquez was written by Antonio Palomino. This text, which forms the third section of the book Museo Pictórico y Escala Óptica, put the artist on the cultural map of Europe. Its title is El Parnaso Español Pintoresco Laureado, and it was published in 1724, almost 68 years after Velázquez's death. Palomino, who was himself a painter at court, was able to garner, I'm garbling, information from the younger contemporaries of Velázquez, then residing in Madrid in 1678, the year in which he arrived from his native Córdoba. However, Palomino had a specific goal in mind when he set to write the biography, which was to offer up Velázquez as a paradigm of the nobility of painting. As a result, Palomino's text is part biography and part hagiography, and by no means does it trespass the boundaries of the inner world of the artist. Palomino's biography has stood the test of time, though, and the details he provides may be considered as accurate unless proved otherwise. Needless to say, there are no writings by Velázquez himself on any but the most mundane matters. The financial rewards of his position at court, working for a wealthy, admiring patron, liberated Velázquez from the uncertainties of the public marketplace. An unintended consequence of royal patronage was to shelter his creations in the palaces of the King of Spain. He was truly little known outside Madrid or his paintings until the early 19th century. Although his genius was recognized by influential Spanish writers and painters, Francisco de Goya was one of his earlier Spanish aficionados. The turning point in his critical reception outside Spain was the opening of the Prado in 1819, which finally allowed outsiders to take full measure of his genius. However, it was not until the later years of the 19th century that the archives were more systematically combed for documentation. For information about his early years in Seville, 1599 when he was born, to 1623, the primary source is his teacher and father-in-law, Francisco Pacheco, seen here in a portrait in the Prado. Pacheco wrote a treatise entitled Arte de la Pintura, which was published posthumously in 1649. On reading the text, one can deduce that Velázquez was a child prodigy and an independent. That's not him either. Take my word for it. He was a child prodigy. I meant to show one of his early bodegones, but no matter. An independent, even a rebellious young artist. His early paintings defy the idealizing canon of his master, who admired Michelangelo above all other artists. Pacheco forgives his star pupil for straying from this path and turning to nature as his source of inspiration. In his personal life, however, Velázquez was conventional. In 1618, he married Pacheco's daughter, Juana, and with one known exception was a faithful husband. The documented instance of infidelity involved an encounter with a woman in Rome during his second sojourn in Italy of 1649-50. From this union was born a son, Antonio, who is never heard of again. His social ambitions are well known and derive from Pacheco's tutelage in the nobility of painting. His struggle to attain the status of a nobleman in a social milieu that often treated artists as laborers can be traced back to the 15th century writings of the humanist Alberti. Velázquez was what might be called a patient opportunist. He made his plans well in advance and carefully accumulated the social capital he would need to secure his knighthood in the Order of Santiago in 1659, which took almost 30 years to achieve. We can be certain that when Velázquez was appointed Pintor Real, royal painter, in 1623, he met with stiff resistance from the court painters then in place, notably Vicente Carducho. I always manage somehow. Here we go. Self-portrait of Vicente Carducho, one of the key figures in Spanish painting of the early 17th century. Carducho, who knew an upstart when he saw one, and was furious that this provincial painter, while ignoring the principles of high art, rose effortlessly to the top of the table among the royal painters. This simmering rivalry came to the boil in a famous competition of 1627, which pitted Velázquez against the veteran royal painters, Vicente Carducho, Eugenio Cajes, and Angelo Nardi, all of Italian origin or descent, and all appointed during the government of the Duke of Lerma. Velázquez owed his summons to court to Lerma's successor, the Count Duke of Olivares, who came to power in 1621. Among Olivares' goals was cleaning the court of Lerma's creatures, as they're called, his dependents. Velázquez's version of the expulsion of the Moriscos from Spain by Philip III was the theme of the competition, and Velázquez was declared the winner. From this point, Velázquez was not to be stopped. He was an overnight sensation who had spent years preparing for his eventual triumph. This steely determination could at times turn into arrogance. A good example is his signature on the surrender of Breda, which formed part of an ensemble of 12 battle paintings used to decorate the Hall of Realms of the Buen Retiro. This is Velázquez's surrender of Breda. Velázquez included in the corner of the painting a sheet of paper known as a cartolino, on which a painter would normally inscribe his signature. However, the paper in the surrender of Breda is blank. Two of the three images for the same commission, executed by his longtime rival, Vicente Carducho, are ostentatiously fitted with Latin inscriptions, including the painter's name. As far as Velázquez was concerned, he was certain that any well-informed aficionado would recognize that only he could have painted the surrender of Breda. Therefore, no textual indication was necessary. Carducho had been trumped again. In much the same vein is Velázquez's habit of not finishing commissioned paintings, even when they originated from the king. This habit was attributed to what was known as his phlegma, a word that carries the connotation of slowness with a hint of laziness. We know that Velázquez was capable of finishing a work in as few as 3 days. Documents inform us that the portrait of Philip IV at Fraga, just outside this room, was completed in that span of time. For some reason, Philip IV was willing to tolerate this behavior with an inexplicable sense of resignation. The monarch wrote to a correspondent on June 3, 1653, that he still could not send the portraits, presumably of members of the royal family, which were to be made by Velázquez. The portraits had not been completed, and the king believed there was no solution but to wait. This is what he wrote. I will endeavor to send the portraits soon, although I don't dare set a fixed point because Velázquez has deceived me 1,000 times. In the context of court artists of the period, these words defy credibility. A royal painter who did not comply with the orders of his patron, the most powerful ruler in the world, who in turn was resigned to wait until his servant could find time to carry out his orders. Is it the headstrong painter or the faint-hearted monarch who was responsible for this strange state of affairs? If Velázquez was socially ambitious, he also aspired to material rewards. Taking into account his salaries and grants, Velázquez became wealthy. Following his death in August 1660, the contents of his rooms in the prince's quarters of the royal palace were inventoried by two court officials who included the painter's son-in-law and chief assistant, Juan Martínez del Mazo. The trappings are those of a man of means. Scholars have paid attention to the paintings assembled by Velázquez, which included those he had painted and those by other identifiable artists, without much thought about the household furnishings and clothing. It must be remembered that in the 17th century, elaborate gowns and fine Turkish carpets were more costly than paintings. The pieces of decorative art in the Velázquez residence were abundant and often made of precious and semi-precious materials like gemstones and rare minerals. It is impossible to imagine the opulence without reading the inventory. It contained a total of 538 objects, not counting the books, many of which were of utilitarian purpose, to be sure, but many calculated to produce the appearance of luxury and status. In sum, Velázquez threaded his way through the intricacies of court life as he pursued the goal of reinventing himself as a gentleman artist. From modest beginnings in Seville, he had ascended to noble rank, to a conspicuous place at court, and to a style of life that benefited a member of the upper class. Given his social and financial ambitions, it is perhaps understandable that he coolly reached the conclusion that his time was better spent in attending to the king's person than to painting His Majesty's portrait. This is one of the explanations for the decline in his production after 1640. The art of painting could take Velázquez only so far in his quest for wealth and glory, and in the circumstances might even be an obstacle to achieving these goals. The private Velázquez was very private indeed. In the absence of personal writings, the intimate side of his personality and his interactions with families and friends remains unknown. A hint, that's the Frog of Philip I mentioned. A hint of life at home is found in Mazo's family portrait. There are many unanswered questions about this fascinating work, but this is not the place to attempt to answer them. Instead, let us posit that the portrait represents the family of Velázquez, which in a certain sense it is. Mazo had married Velázquez's daughter Francisca. Clearly, this is not the home of a typical painter. Few of whom could dwell in such spacious surroundings. In the background, a painter is working on a large portrait. With our refined knowledge of Velázquez, we can recognize that in all likelihood, the painting being executed in the background is a version of the portrait of the Infanta Margarita. There is no shortage of pretenders. I receive at least 2 inquiries per month about paintings that I call, in the parlance of our time, Velázquez wannabes. I rarely respond to these communications. The owners are convinced that they have struck it rich. Usually they have done some cursory research which, in their eyes, puts the attribution to Velázquez beyond all reasonable doubt. They gather supporting evidence about provenance, cite the bibliography of one exists, pay for the analysis of conservation and technical data, and produce positive opinions of malleable specialists written as long as 50 years ago, although some are of more recent vintage. The element lacking in their pictures is the distinctive technique found in the authentic works, and owners and dealers do not tend to respond with equanimity if I deliver a negative verdict. I have written before about the perils and pitfalls of the game of making attributions. For one thing, they are intrusive and can consume a lot of time that I would prefer to dedicate to my own research projects. Perhaps the biggest reason for ignoring these inquiries is that I do not wish to surrender the liberty to change my mind because of market conditions or other extraneous circumstances. To illustrate the point, let me shift for a moment the focus from Velázquez to his French contemporary, Nicolas Poussin. His painting, known as the Madonna of the Steppes, was considered a prize holding of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. In 1981, a better and little-known version of the composition appeared, which had been hidden away in a French private collection. Specialists in the art of Poussin unanimously have endorsed the opinion that the painting in Washington is a replica by a skilled copyist. Suppose, for a moment, that the Washington version had been owned by a collector, and that you, as a recognized authority on Poussin, had advised him to purchase it. The value has now descended from the millions to the thousands, perhaps to a sum that is even less than the collector had paid. Who is responsible for the decline in value? There are a number of scenarios, in none of which I would care to be a principal actor. I once proposed that attributions come with a warning label. Connoisseurship is an art, not a science. As far as I know, no one has adopted this suggestion. There is another factor to be taken into account that is never mentioned in the discussion of attributions: personal rivalry between specialists. Rivalry, I am convinced, is part of the human genome. The story starts with Cain and Abel and continues to this day. Almost every month brings a tale of one dispute or another about what may or may not turn out to be an important work of art, be it the Getty Kouros or an early sculpture by Michelangelo. Rivalry exposes emotions that are usually repressed, and from personal experience, I can say that contests about attributions can quickly devolve into struggles for power and authority. For example, while I believe that I know a lot about Velázquez, I am aware that I'm not omniscient and sometimes have to take a wrong turn to find the true path. In 1999, as the 400th anniversary of Velázquez's birth approached, the attributions started to increase. One of these was a Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, which had been acquired at auction by a French dealer in 1990 for a sizable sum of money, with a tentative attribution to Velázquez. He had the picture restored and examined by conservation technicians and put it on the market for several times what he had paid. I can't recall the exact price, but it was in the vicinity of $20 million. I was asked by the dealer to fly to Paris and offer my opinion. I told him that I found the attribution to be acceptable as an early work by Velázquez. Professor Alfonso Pérez Sanchez, my longtime rival, vehemently disagreed and attributed the painting to the early period of Alonso Cano, who had been in the workshop of Francisco Pacheco at the same time as Velázquez. He advised Pierre Rosenberg, then director of the Louvre, not to pursue the acquisition. By the way, the Louvre still does not possess a single authentic work by the master. Pérez Sanchez then proceeded to argue his negative opinion in 3 separate publications. The subtext is that Pérez Sanchez was attempting to assert his authority as a Velázquez expert and to diminish my claim to expertise at the same time. His opinion carried the day. The painting was offered at Sotheby's in 1994 and did not make the reserve. Then it disappeared from view until 2009, when the dealer again put it up for sale. I was amazed to learn that the work had been acquired by the Fundación Focus Abengoa in Seville for its collection in the Hospital de los Venerables in Seville. Their artistic advisor was Dr. Perez Sanchez. I wanted to see how the foundation would handle the attribution. Would they support their advisor's opinion or try to find some way around this delicate conflict? Without fanfare, the supposed intervention by Cano was erased, and the painting is now accepted by one and all as an important early work by Velázquez. Until the end of his days, Alfonso held firm to his attribution to Alonso Cano. Next was an image said to depict Santa Rufina. It was attributed to Velázquez and sold at auction and also acquired by the Fundación Focus Abengoa in 2007. Perez Sanchez, as advisor to the foundation, had a lot riding on the attribution, not least because Santa Rufina is a patron of Seville, so a painting of her by Diego Velázquez would have a more potent cultural combination in that part of the woods than could hardly be imagined. I had expressed my doubts about the attribution and certainly was concerned about the condition, which I could only be described as fair. A local art historian with a sense of humor dubbed it Santa Ruina. Alfonso rallied his troops, and in the spring of 2008, an exhibition of comparable paintings borrowed from the Prado took place to fortify the attribution. The catalog is in the form of a 100-page book with studies by Alfonso, Benito Navarrete, Peter Cherry, and Carmen Garrido, the head of the technical section of the Prado. In a way, this counterattack was flattering. My opinion was certainly being taken seriously. However, ultimately I swallowed hard and accepted that the evidence was against me. There are bound to be paintings that one dislikes, but nevertheless are accepted as authentic. Frankly, I doubt we will ever see a major work by Velázquez come onto the market again, unless the Duke of Westminster decides to sell his writing lesson of Baltasar Carlos. However, we have as many great pictures as needed to confirm the place of Velázquez in the firmament of Western painting, and Las Meninas is one of the brightest stars. I have devoted a great deal of thought to studying this enigmatic painting and have read the numerous interpretations that have been published. I feel in my bones that I may be suffering from the early stages of LMFS, Las Meninas fatigue syndrome. I hasten to add that I'm not referring to the painting, but to the writing about it. Part of the responsibility must be apportioned to Michel Foucault, whose musings on Las Meninas sent numerous writers baying like a pack of hounds after a wily fox. I doubt that Foucault ever expected the reaction engendered by his essay. More dispiriting were the interpretations of his clever followers, each cannier than his or her predecessor. The line of interpretation followed by traditional art historians was not much more helpful. All suffered from the same deficiency, which was to grab hold of some detail or feature in the painting which would open the door to a definitive interpretation. But first, some of the ambiguities had to be clarified, whatever the cost of credibility. What is Velázquez painting on the large canvas in front of him? Where are the king and queen standing? What is the significance of the pictures on the rear wall? What are the purpose and function of the mirror and its relationship, if any, to reality? Would emblems answer our questions, or should we rely on geometry and the rules of perspective? In desperation, I'm almost tempted to give it all up, but the painting's undeniable magnetism draws me in yet again. One day, I was driving in Princeton with the radio tuned to the public station. An interview with a pop singer was in progress. I never caught his name. However, I almost ran off the road when I heard this exchange. The interviewer asked the musician to explain the intention of the song he had written, to which the musician equivocally replied, "Different people take away different things from it." He had delivered the last word on Las Meninas and many other masterpieces of art, visual and otherwise. The mixture of grandeur and ambiguity of which masterpieces are contrived is indeed intoxicating. The multiplicity and variety of interpretations cannot be analyzed here. Instead, I want to focus on how the people of Velázquez's epoch, the so-called first audience, understood this enigmatic painting. And I want to focus on its pictorial qualities instead of its textuality. We know a certain number of facts thanks to the biography of Antonio Palomino, who furnishes the names of those in the tableau. The setting is identified as a specific set of rooms in the royal palace. He dates the painting very late in the painter's life, stating that it was done after he had been accepted as a Knight of Santiago. This event occurred on November 29, 1659. Velázquez died on August 6th of 1660. However, most writers believe that the work was executed around 1656, on the assumption that the Infanta, who was born on July 12, 1651, appears to be 6 years old. Nonetheless, the date of 1656 presents an insurmountable obstacle because the painter is depicted wearing the Red Cross of Santiago before he was elected to this highly prestigious knightly order. Within the social context of the Spanish court, this was simply impossible. Perhaps this is why Palomino invented the anecdote that after the painter's death and on the orders of Philip IV, the cross was added to the self-portrait. Yet there is no evidence on the surface. This is a detail of the cross, obviously. On the orders of Philip IV, the cross was added to the self-portrait. Yet there is no evidence on the surface of the canvas to confirm that this event ever occurred, nor does technical examination find any trace of 2 layers of paint. The execution of the cross is entirely consistent with the rest of the canvas and displays the same subtle brushwork. As a consequence, the date of supposed execution may be set aside and confidently placed between November 28, 1659 and April of 1660, when Velázquez left to accompany the king to Irún on the French border. If we accept that Velázquez created the work after his admission to the Order of Santiago, it may be understood as a token of gratitude offered to a monarch whose patronage had affirmed for all time the nobility of the artist and artistic enterprise. Philip had made it possible for Velázquez to attain wealth, honor, and fame, and made extraordinary efforts to secure membership for his painter in the knightly order. Despite the fact that he failed to secure membership for his painter in the knightly order, despite the fact that he failed to satisfy, that is, Velázquez, all the criteria set forth in the rule of the order. My premise is that Velázquez Las Meninas is purely a product of the painter's imagination. Fact is turned into fiction. Accordingly, the Infanta's figure could be as large or as small as met the needs of the composition. Las Meninas was the artist's way of saying, "Thank you, Your Majesty." All the components could have been seen in the palace. The result is what might be called a manipulated interpretation of the reality of life in the royal palace. Velázquez desired to create the greatest painting that the connoisseur king had ever laid eyes on it. The king evidently understood the gesture and installed the canvas in his private office in the summer quarters. This approach leaves a very small window for execution, 4 months at all, and at a time when Velázquez was burdened with the complicated arrangements for the royal journey to the French border to sign the Peace of Pyrenees with the King of France. The feat of painting this large canvas in such a short period is a prime example of what is known in Italian art theory as sprezzatura, the seemingly effortless conquest of the difficult. As we have seen, Velázquez could paint rapidly when he cared to. In working out his conception for Las Meninas, he intensified the rhythm of creation as seen in the absence of any fine, detailed use of the brush, turning instead to the sketch-like application of the colors. There is another layer of meaning embodied in Las Meninas that might well have been understood by aficionados. This approach sets the painting within the context of a major theoretical debate of the time, namely, which was the most important prerequisite for the creation of a great painting, drawing or color? Up to and including Velázquez's period, learned opinion had declared drawing as the victor, citing the work of Raphael and Michelangelo as proof of the argument. The appointed leader of the band of colorists was Titian, a great painter, no doubt, but weak in the art of drawing and careless in his brushwork. In Spain, this judgment was questioned. Works by Titian were considered to be second to none. This exalted position was secured by the patronage of the Habsburgs, especially by the Emperor Charles V. His son, Philip II, was an even more enthusiastic patron of Titian. The Spanish dynasty's dedication to Titian, and indeed to the practice of painterly painting, was amplified by Philip IV, who avidly collected important painters by the Venetian master. His other favorite painter was Peter Paul Rubens, who was believed to be Titian's legitimate successor. The precedence of drawing over color was known to Velázquez, whose interest in Italian art theory was certainly informed. In a painting done in Rome in 1630, Joseph's bloodied coat brought to Isaac, he proved that he could master the rules of neoclassical painting, particularly the one known as affetti, or the use of gesture and gaze to externalize emotions. However, as we see in the remainder of his output, Velázquez threw his lot in with the colorists and their sketchy technique. Given the exalted status of Titian and Rubens at the court of Spain, he had no choice. And once he had made the choice, Titian and Rubens became his rivals, as Vicente Carduccio had been a rival at a much earlier stage of the artist's career. In Las Meninas, he rises to the challenge. Las Meninas is a rebuttal to those who champion drawing as the standard of excellence and an affirmation of the power and potential of naturalist art, of painterly painting. Velázquez's involvement in the debate may now seem arcane. The contest between drawing and color is long since settled, neither wins, and of no consequence to the artistic production of today. However, in the 17th century, it was a burning issue. Unfortunately, Velázquez could not participate openly in the debate, despite the praise later heaped upon his masterpiece. Las Meninas was a prisoner in the Alcázar, the royal palace of Madrid, and was virtually unseen except by a few connoisseurs. Among them was the renowned Italian artist Luca Giordano, who was the royal painter from 1692 to 1702. As I have said, Las Meninas was hidden treasure until it was moved to the Prado in 1819 and discovered, in quotation marks, by French and English painters, who quickly grasped the implications of the picture and its challenge to the dominant tradition of Western art. One of the terms Palomino uses to describe the painting is as a nuevo capriccio. Nowadays, caprice means whimsy. For Palomino's epoch, the word carried a different meaning. And here I'm quoting from the Diccionario de Autoridades, published in Madrid in 1726. Capriccio is a judgment formed by an idea and generally outside the common and ordinary rules. In other words, Las Meninas breaks the rules. It is a figment of the imagination designed to demonstrate the painter's unprecedented virtuosity and originality. The first stage was his rivalry with Titian and Rubens, whom he respected, but had to surpass. Velázquez sunk them in the shadows. Deep in the background of the spinners is a tapestry. The composition is a partial view of Titian's Rape of Europa, one of the masterpieces of the royal collection. This very painting had been copied by Rubens during his visit to the court of Spain in 1628-29. And Las Meninas again confronts Rubens, well, you won't be able to see this. But in the back on the rear wall are installed two copies of paintings by Rubens, which were executed by Velázquez's son-in-law, Martinez del Mazo. The originals by Rubens were part of a commission for the Torre de la Parada, to which Velázquez had contributed. Titian and Rubens appear as footnotes in Velázquez's dissertation on the art of painting. Now he had to defend his thesis. The best way to understand Las Meninas is to look at it for a long period of time, to scrutinize the surface part by part, and then take a few steps back and observe how every detail comes into focus. You will be following in the footsteps of every writer on Velázquez and the countless visitors who have seen it at the Prado. I dare say that only a few paintings of the time require this sort of bodily movement of the viewer to complete a work of painting. X-radiographs reveal an astounding fact. It appears that Velázquez painted directly on the canvas without making a preliminary study. This was his customary practice. The painting is what might be called a calculated improvisation, a deliberate tour de force. Velázquez's self-confidence borders on arrogance, a component of his personality already analyzed. The painting also carries the message that the painter had achieved his personal goals, despite the obstacles put in his way at every path, at every step of the way. He is a Knight of Santiago and has privileged access to the royal family. Las Meninas is greater than the sum of its parts, but the parts also need to be appreciated as much as the whole. The composition, particularly the sense of an interrupted action or intrusion, and the outward gaze of most of the protagonists, have been understood by many, myself included, to posit that a specific event is occurring involving the king and queen who are somewhere in the space or standing just outside it. As an alternate hypothesis, I suggest that the illusion of a moment suspended in time has no other purpose than to enliven and unify the composition and to provide a pretext for this demonstration of artistic brilliance. Among other things, Las Meninas is a group portrait. Group portraits are often identified as hierarchical hieroglyphs of social status, pictorial documents which happen to be a work of art. They were especially popular in Holland during the 17th century and tend to follow a similar formula. The subjects are frozen in time, their gazes fixed, their poses unmistakably contrived. Each figure occupies its own space. To my knowledge, only one Dutch group portrait successfully broke through the barrier of artificiality into the promised land of verisimilitude. Rembrandt's sampling officials of the Drapers' Guild of 1662. As in Las Meninas, the unity of action is achieved by the simple maneuver of focusing all the gazes at some unspecified point outside the frame, and subtly using gesture, expression, and pose to animate the reactions of the sitters. As seen in details, Las Meninas is executed with unsurpassed virtuosity. The profound complexity of touches viewed at close hand, and the subtle interplay between the weave of the canvas and the colors are essential components of the genius of the painting. Velázquez, it seemed, wished to devise a composition that would permit him to display his mastery of the widest imaginable effects of light, shadow, and color. I have come to believe that Las Meninas was designed by Velázquez to display his infinite resources as a painterly painter, and of course to demonstrate his personal relationship with the monarch. There is no other painting of the 17th century that compares. At close range, as we've seen in these details, the surface looks like a jumble of incoherent strokes of the brush, and then miraculously, once you have taken those crucial few steps backward, everything snaps into place to represent a living, breathing gathering of the Infanta and her entourage. The composition may seem to be unpremeditated. However, it was pondered like the moves of a master chess player. In conclusion, there are no mysteries of Las Meninas, no hidden meanings to uncover, no codes to be deciphered, no secrets to be revealed. Luca Giordano got it right when the king asked his opinion of the monumental canvas. At first, the painter was speechless. Then he proclaimed, "This is the theology of painting," by which he meant to say that as theology is superior among the sciences, this picture is superior in painting. Las Meninas is an unsurpassed example of pictorial mastery and a demonstration of the steely self-confidence required to challenge not only the social hierarchy of the Spanish court, but also the canons of Western art. Thank you.